Thank you. I'm sure Ned has a question, but let me just, is this on? The frontal-parietal networks, you're referring to both the two different, both the default mode network and the sensory-based arousal. They're both frontal-parietal, one is lateral, one is midline. And I take it what you're saying is that people in minimally conscious or vegetative states, or what you're calling it now, might not have the thalamocortical arousal, but they have the default mode networks active, and they may be conscious. Is that what you're saying?
So I think we have increasing evidence that this frontal-parietal network is important for awareness, and that the study of these patients is, I think, medically very interesting, but also scientifically, because you really there have a patient who's awake yet unaware, in contrast to all the smart subliminal and masking paradigms in volunteers. So it's always one part of awareness. Here is the global loss of awareness. We next can, I think, this is an oversimplification, reduce awareness to these two main components. External, indeed, more lateral. Internal, more midline. The relation between internal awareness, it is much overlapping with this default mode, but then there's different ways to study the default mode, and then it gets a bit more complicated. And the importance of cortical-cortical and thalamocortical, we've seen some evidence that both are important. I think there the question is still open, and there is this thalamic switch hypothesis, and I'm sure we will hear more about that from anesthesiology. But
you're saying that you don't need the thalamocortical input in the default mode. You can be conscious without thalamic input. Is that what you're saying?
No, I think for you to be consciously aware, really what is critical is this connectivity within this frontal-parietal network with cortical-cortical and thalamocortical. So those patients who were unconscious had no thalamocortical loops. When they recovered consciousness, thalamocortical came back. Then it depends, and we heard that already, how tricky it can be methods-wise in volunteers, also in these patients. It depends which tools you will use. Are you going to look at the default mode with PET scanning, with EEG, with fMRI? Are you going to use it in fMRI with a seed voxel or an independent component analysis? There are many, many methodological issues where we need to be very careful. And we try basically in these patients where we cannot have an interaction with them, they cannot talk, so we try to make their scans talk. And of course we need to be careful. We have false positives, we have false negatives, so it's very tricky, and we there need the input from the engineers, from the physicists, and they offer us the tools to say better and better documented things about residual awareness. But so far I think that yes, there is this relationship between this functional connectivity in the network and the presence or absence of awareness.
One final question for me. We heard a talk last night about olfaction going directly. Have you ever tested smell in your patients?
So it's a very interesting afferent system, of course, where you don't need to go through the thalamus. And there is a number of scales that look at responses to olfaction, and we've been looking at them. So far, have not been convinced that the responses we observe would truly be more than reflexes.
So even in the patients you described who could answer the questions by imagining playing tennis or imagining spatial navigation, those patients, in addition to some kind of conscious awareness, also had the ability to organize a response and the motivation to organize a response. So I'm wondering if you've thought about the issue of trying to see whether some patients might have conscious awareness without the motivation or either the motivation or the ability to organize, to think about the options and organize the response. And this may be a different question, but it looked to me like in your pain areas, in the minimally conscious patients, there wasn't a lot of frontal-parietal involvement in what you were describing as pain perception in minimally conscious patients.
So the first question about motivation, I think it's really a big problem. So already clinically, our awareness test is raise your left hand. The thing is, if we ask Stewart to raise his left hand, he doesn't do it, right? Now, so there might be a number of reasons why he's not doing it. Maybe he's deaf, so we would write it down, really. Maybe he wants to do it and his motor cortex tell move the hand, but there is a lesion in the nerve, spinal cord, brainstem, and these are the cases then that we pick up with this fMRI, imagine playing tennis, or brain-computer interface. But also, it's possible that Stewart doesn't want to move his hand, and then we really have a problem. And it actually, I remember one patient who had akinetic mutism, which is an entity now part of minimally conscious state, and as the word says, they're akinetic, mute, and they have this big problem of, you know, they would take the stairs if they're put in front of the stairs, but they really take no initiative whatsoever. So the problem of motivation is really existing, and I remember this patient telling me, I remember you asked me to look up and look down, but I just didn't see any reason why I would do it. And I don't think we've studied that problem, but it's an existing one. This also is the reason why we use these emotionally salient stimuli. The own face, the own name, where you have this attention-grabbing properties. And we often hear stories where patients considered vegetative, unconscious, the first sign they would show is that they would start shaking when somebody in the family said a dirty joke or when something funny happened. So I think we can make more use than we currently do of those emotional relevant stimuli, but still we have this problem. What if the patient simply doesn't want to? If you have a solution, please tell me.
Let me add one point. In anesthesia, when patients wake up, we ask them to take a deep breath, open their eyes, cough, and often they'll do that, but I'm not convinced they're conscious because coming out of anesthesia, they seem to be in a zombie mode. So it's possible they could respond non-consciously too.
So there I think we have the difference between consciousness and memory. Maybe we wrote this paper with Sanders that came out in anesthesiology, the difference between unresponsiveness and unconsciousness. And I think that we see patients with pre-medication that undergo some minor injury, and they would do what we ask them to do. We do whatever intervention, ask them turn left or right, they would do it, and afterwards you ask them questions, they say, I was gone, it's total blackout, and yet I think that they were conscious at that very moment.
Even though they deny it.
Even though afterwards they forget it. So this is a trick of consciousness and memory, I think.
I've generated indirect evidence that there are feedback loops between the thalamus and the sensory cortices, which are activated during the self-transcending processes of meditation, and that these actually increase the feedback gain. I was very interested in your feedback loops between the thalamus and the frontal and parietal cortices, and I just wondered how these might interact and how you might comment on it.
So I think, again, meditation is a very interesting state that can help us better understand these neural correlates. So far, we've not been doing any research in that field. I think there's a very interesting literature. The results are not always going in the same direction. We've been studying a lot hypnotic state, which can, I think, to some extent be compared with meditation, where you have kind of increase of this internal awareness and a decrease of external awareness. And the results we've seen is that indeed these networks seem to change. But of course, I think much more research is needed. And the challenge is to really know what we're talking about. And meditation, there's many different ways to induce it, to different schools. And there the challenge for us neuroscientifics will be to really bring it into the peer-reviewed literature. And this is, I think, happening right now and is highly needed.
How does the Glasgow brain function test correlate with the PET scan and the functional MRI?
The Glasgow Coma scale. Yeah. So I think the Glasgow Coma scale did a great job for coma. and it's worldwide the most used consciousness scale, but it is good for coma. When you're dealing with these patients who are emerged from their coma, it's no longer a valid tool. And we and others have shown that then there's a big problem of misdiagnosis. Then really we need those validated tools like the coma recovery scale. The Glasgow Coma, for example, doesn't look at eye tracking. It has 3 components. One is the verbal component, which is very often impossible to do because patients are intubated and so you lose a lot of information from the scale. So people have been developing alternatives. I think one of the most interesting ones is the one developed at Mayo Clinics. It's called the 4, and it has an alternative where you just can verbally show that you're aware by non-verbal communication, but it is at present of course, much less used than the Glasgow Coma scale.
Yeah. Yes. Whoops. Is it possible to go back to your last slide that showed the thalamus and the default and so on? If not, I'll wing it.
Yes.
Or any, you showed it actually several times where you showed the thalamus and the default and the problem solving. Well, okay, let me start it while you're going back to it.
Oui.
Interestingly, the graphics.
It went minimally conscious.
Okay. Now, okay, the very last slide had it, I know.
Yes, but ask your question, I will.
Okay, I'll ask the question. The graphics showed the thalamus with the default. Now, we think mainly of the thalamus tied in with what Stu was saying. We think the thalamus more tied in with the feed-in of information and so on. But let me try this out. That the anterior thalamus and the medial dorsal and so on, the more anterior parts of the thalamus peg in mainly to the thalamic, the frontal posterior, frontal-parietal thalamic type of loops. Much of the lateral thalamus ties in with the actual sensory feed. So you get VPL bringing in stuff in terms of the bodily kind of stuff. A little more medial to that brings in more like the body kind of stuff and the somatosensory visceral type of stuff. And then you mentioned the ILN, the interlaminar, very medial, dorsal and so on, which seems to be crucial for turning on the cortex in various parts, so for the basic arousal type of things. So now that's kind of sketchy, but it would seem like the thalamus, different parts of the thalamus would be activated during the default, and somewhat different perhaps during the problem-solving type of things, and perhaps still others specifically tied in with the parietal frontal loops and so on.
So there's a whole literature on these projections, VPL, VPM, anterior. And of course, in these patients, things get much more difficult because they have, we're talking about a small structure, and we're trying to say something about nuclei within this small structure. And I think we need to be careful where spatial normalization in these patients, which is needed when we do group studies, with such deformed brains is a real challenge, and they have atrophied brains, atrophied thalami, lesions in the thalamus. So I wouldn't go too far in the interpretation of where exactly we are. We gave some evidence that the interlaminar central nuclei, and we know that indeed they project widely to this frontal-parietal network, are important. We tried to put seeds in different thalamic areas, but I think it's a big challenge in this patient population because their brains are severely abnormal spatially. So again, there the new and high field MRIs are getting us better and better pictures, and so we hope to be able to zoom in into this fascinating structure, which is the thalamus, and say something about the substructures, but at present, it's a challenge.
Have you used SQUID, superconducting quantum interference devices, to look for gamma wave synchrony? I saw a concurrent session yesterday where a group used that, and where a master had registered 126 hertz on that. So have you thought of it, or you correlated with it with anything?
So again, it's a challenge in this specific population when you're looking at with EEG or MEG at high frequencies, because they, as said, have a lot of artifacts coming from the muscles. So if you cannot use neuromuscular blocking agents, which often you can't in the chronic disorders, and when they're not unconscious anymore, you can't, and then it's very tricky for us to really interpret the data in terms of high frequency. So again, we're working on it. We have MEG data I didn't show because indeed the whole high frequency gamma band and so on hypothesis in this particular population, where there's a lot of spasticity and very important muscle artifacts, we still have a challenge to filter them out. Last question.
Concerning the debate earlier in the hot or not, could you offer some suggestions from your work on how that might inform that debate?
Indeed. As said, I think this meeting is fascinating because we have these different disciplines and philosophers meeting neuroscientists, meeting clinicians, and we try to translate this into clinical realities, but it's a challenge.
Well, I disagree with both views, but I think his findings would support hot as opposed to not, because frontal-parietal was necessary for consciousness. But that's okay. One more question, right there.
I imagine, being in one of the states you described, that I might want to make you think I'm dead and switch off the machines. And how far do you take into account this possibility in your research?
To make me think you're dead will be difficult. Then you would have Cotard syndrome. We actually had a patient sent from the UK. It was the first time I was called by the nurse with a patient that said, who said, I'm dead. We actually scanned him. I will show you in 2 years the results. You can, as said, not regarding the diagnosis of death, which I think is straightforward, and you cannot fake brain death. You cannot fake that all brainstem reflexes would be absent, but you can indeed not answer, and we would fail with all of these fancy tests. And this is coming back to Ned Block's question about motivation, and I think this is a big issue. It's also in the literature on how we can use these technologies as lie detectors, and how you can, you know, misguide the experimenter. And I think it's a big problem.